Hello guys, this is Real Recaps. In this video, I will talk about a 2022 American horror science fiction film, Brightwood. Before we start, I hope you will like and subscribe to the channel. Jen goes for a run, listening to a podcast about preparing for divorce, while her husband, Dan, struggles to keep pace, seeking her attention. Their long marriage has accumulated unresolved tensions. Jen speeds onto a trail looping around a pond, and Dan eventually catches up, persuading her to stop. She criticizes his appearance, confusing him as he notes she's also changed. Dan points out the scenic pond and suggests taking a picture together. Jen agrees, posing briefly before resuming her run. As she runs, she questions why Dan joined her, especially after his behavior the previous night. At a party meant to celebrate her promotion, Dan got drunk, embarrassed her in front of colleagues, and flirted with an elderly accountant. Annoyed by the memory, Jen picks up her pace, leaving Dan trailing behind. Soon, Dan falls out of rhythm and slows to a walk while Jen presses on through the forest. As Jen runs, she notices a hooded figure standing along the trail but ignores him and continues forward. Dan feels a sharp pain in his head, while Jen hears a piercing sound that makes her stop momentarily. Everything returns to normal, and they proceed separately. Jen finishes the loop back at the starting point but realizes Dan isn't there. She searches for him, while Dan, stumbling through some bushes, notices something bump into him. Though startled, he finds no one nearby and feels disoriented. He then comes across a barrel of stagnant water containing trash and a pair of headphones identical to Jen's. Meanwhile, Jen returns, telling Dan there's something strange she wants to show him. Dan attempts to catch up but quickly tires, pleading for her to stop and listen to his apology. He admits she's right about the struggles in their marriage and their missed opportunities. Jen points out the starting sign, noting the odd absence of the trail. Dan wonders if there were two signs, but Jen disagrees. She resumes running, leaving Dan behind as he complains of a headache. Eventually, they meet at the sign again. Dan counts 4 loops completed, but Jen insists it's been just one, despite the trail still being absent. They begin to sense something is wrong, as every loop seems to reset them. Dan suggests they split up, and Jen agrees. Before parting, Dan apologizes, confessing that while their long marriage sometimes frustrated him, he still loves her. Jen moves ahead, finding a sign that forbids swimming near the pond. Nothing seems to change. Dan, on a separate path, also finds no exit leading back to the city. Both grow increasingly unsettled, trying to convince themselves things will improve. Soon, they cross paths again. Jen accuses Dan of scaring her, but he claims he hasn't seen her in a while. She confesses her fear, and Dan apologizes. They return to the "no swimming" sign, staring at it together. Dan asks if Jen hears a ringing sound, but she attributes it to his hangover. He questions why anyone would swim in the dirty pond, and Jen agrees, puzzled about the sign's purpose. Jen suggests the sign itself might be the reason no one swims in the pond and asks Dan to remove it. Despite his efforts, the sign won't budge. She attempts to call someone, but her headphones fall to the ground as she realizes there's no signal. Dan checks his phone and confirms the lack of coverage. They follow the trail, hoping to find reception, only to pass the barrel again. Jen insists they continue. After running for a while, they encounter the hooded figure once more, standing silently. Frightened, they turn and run in the opposite direction, only to return to the "no swimming" sign. This time, Jen spots another pair of headphones on the ground. Holding both pairs, she accuses Dan of orchestrating a prank to get back at her for the party. Dan denies it, asking how he could manipulate the landscape. Jen refuses to believe him, demanding he stop his tricks. Dan suggests they cut through the forest. Exhausted from trekking through thick undergrowth, Jen remarks that they should have found something by now. This isn't remote wilderness, yet there are no signs of life or civilization. As Dan proposes a rest, Jen suddenly hears the ringing sound too. Dan teases her about not being hungover, and she suggests they recall the highway's location, but neither can determine the direction. Dan tries to start a conversation, but Jen dismisses him, overwhelmed by violent thoughts of harming him. She finds him unbearable. He snores, neglects himself, and has bad breath. Bluntly, she admits her feelings, shocking Dan. He reminds her of their long history together, likening their situation to a recurring dream. Jen admits she wishes to be happy with someone else and coldly states that he'll end up alone. Surprisingly, Dan agrees, calling it fair. They discuss their plans post-escape, agreeing to divorce. Jen suggests Dan move in with his mother, but he declines, noting his mother's fondness for Jen. Jen dismisses this, claiming his mother has always lied to him. They awkwardly decide to inform people of their separation and press on, with Dan choosing their direction. Their search leads them back to the pond once more. Jen breaks down, screaming in denial. Frustrated, they sprint away but inevitably return to the sign. Jen screams again, and Dan's laughter turns bitter as he questions whether this is some cruel trick. Exhausted, the couple sits silently, unable to decide their next move. Suddenly, they hear a man's voice shouting for someone to run, even though no one is visible. Dan struggles to comprehend the situation, while Jen calmly suggests that the voice might be urging them to flee. They continue along the trail until they spot a hooded figure ahead. This time, the figure darts into the forest. The couple decides to follow and eventually catches up, finding the man standing with his back to them. They approach cautiously, asking him several questions, but he remains silent and doesn't turn around. Jen urges Dan to confront him, but he hesitates. Dan throws a small rock at the figure, but there's no reaction. Finally, Jen taps the man on the shoulder before retreating behind Dan. Just then, another hooded figure rushes past them, prompting the first man to turn around and shout at them to run. To their horror, the man looks exactly like Dan. Stunned, Dan glances at Jen, only to notice another hooded figure standing behind her. Before he can react, this new figure brutally stabs Jen with a sharpened stick. Overcome with terror, Dan bolts into the forest, eventually stumbling back onto the trail. He collides with someone and hears his own voice angrily complaining about nearly being knocked over. Shaken, he runs faster, haunted by visions of his bloodied, screaming wife. Eventually, Dan reaches the pond, disoriented and unsure of what to do. He hears another scream from the woods, urging him to run. Moments later, he finds Jen alive and well, standing as if nothing happened. Dan tells her to stay put while he runs off, ignoring her desperate pleas. He retreats to a nearby tree, vomiting from the shock. Once he collects himself, he returns to Jen, confused about how she could still be alive. Dan proposes they try a different direction, and Jen, equally puzzled, agrees. They walk for what feels like a long time but end up back at the same "no swimming" sign. Dan questions who would swim in such a dirty pond, but Jen suggests someone might if the sun were shining. She picks up a tangled mess of headphones from the ground, though her own pair is still in her pocket. Dan notices that Jen's shoulders are sunburned and suggests calling for help, but there's still no signal. Frustrated, he walks ahead, with Jen trailing close behind. As they make their way through the woods, Dan turns to Jen, vowing not to lose her and assuring her that they'll find a way out. Confused, Jen doesn't understand his sudden resolve. Dan insists that once they escape, they'll start appreciating each other again. Out of nowhere, another version of Dan appears and strikes the first Dan on the head with a stick before running off to vomit nearby. This new Dan complains angrily about Jen never warning him how bad his hair looked. Bewildered, Jen complies when he asks her to remove the sweatshirt from the unconscious Dan. She accuses this version of Dan of not realizing she's from a different time loop and declares that all Dans are the same person. Meanwhile, the original Dan regains consciousness, and the second Dan begins attacking him. Unable to watch, Jen grabs a branch and kills the first Dan. As echoes of their earlier arguments and screams urging them to run fill the air, the couple confronts the bizarre reality of their situation. They spot other versions of themselves on the trail. Horrified, Dan is unnerved by the sight of himself, experiencing the strangeness of seeing his own actions from an outsider's perspective. Jen silences him, pointing out that the other pair hasn't yet realized they're stuck in repeating loops. Dan suggests they follow the other versions, but Jen protests, begging him never to leave her again. She fears being left alone or encountering an evil version of Dan. Dan wonders if there are different versions of themselves, possibly happier ones. Jen, however, believes they're in a kind of hell. Hearing the word hell, Dan speculates that they might already be dead, perhaps from a car accident or an animal attack, which could explain their surreal predicament. Jen interrupts his musings, asking him to stop talking because she's tired. She then theorizes that an alien crash might have created this strange situation and trapped them at the center of it. Suddenly, they hear voices. Another version of Dan and Jen is arguing nearby. Jen comments that she looks attractive, while Dan remarks on how cute they look fighting. The other versions run off in different directions, and Jen speculates that this might be a lesson they need to learn to fix everything. Dan, however, thinks only the best versions of themselves will manage to escape. Just then, another Dan appears, only to be killed in front of them. Unable to handle the sight, the couple flees. Jen asks Dan to catch food, but he reminds her they haven't seen a single animal. They wander endlessly until they come across a trail. Jen wonders aloud what she would do here alone, prompting Dan to suggest she might be reconsidering the divorce. Frustrated, Jen reminds him she's already killed him once and tells him to stop talking. Another scream from the woods urges them to run. As they continue walking, Jen suddenly has a breakdown, panicking at the thought of dying in this place. Dan tries to console her, even as she lashes out at him in despair. She feels she's losing her mind and can no longer distinguish right from wrong. In an effort to comfort her, Dan kisses her, and both realize that despite everything, they still love each other. Jen then spots a makeshift tent in the woods. They approach cautiously and find a tangled mess of headphones, Dan's phone, and the decomposed corpse of one of his versions. It dawns on them that escape is impossible. They're trapped indefinitely. Facing this grim truth, they confess their love for each other. At that moment, a hooded figure emerges and kills Dan. Jen tries to flee but trips over another version of herself. She runs to the lake, encountering doppelgangers of herself and Dan along the way. She swims across the pond and rests on a boulder, noticing a silver sphere in the bushes. While staring at her reflection, she is killed by another version of herself wearing a filthy hoodie. Later, this hoodie-clad Jen drags the body to camp, where another Dan eats raw meat from one of their duplicates. It becomes clear that a version of the couple has resorted to cannibalism to survive the endless purgatory they're trapped in. The end. Thanks for watching.